2 weeks ago, I went over the shooting process of my short film Encounter. Now it's time for the last behind the scenes video of the film. In this video, I'll be going over everything that happened in post-production, from editing to color grading all the way to sound design and VFX. After the first day of shooting, I reviewed my footage on the same day to see whether I need to panic or if I can move on. Fortunately, the footage looks surprisingly good. You might remember that the weather conditions were not the best, therefore I was a little worried, but after I color graded a few shots, I saw that this was going to be fine. On the same day, I made my selections and the rough cut of the sequences we had already shot. A few days later, after completing the second shoot day, I did pretty much the same. It didn't take at all long until I had a basic rough cut of the film. I still had many clips missing though, such as the opening, this transitional shot, and the voiceovers. Therefore, I added text as a placeholder in the timeline, which I replaced with the actual clips after shooting them. Looking back at the post-production, the time spent actually editing is pretty small in relation to all the other tasks. Here's an estimated chart according to my memory of about the relative amount of time I spent with certain parts of the post-production. After editing the rough cut, I already went into color grading simply because I was so looking forward to it. So let me go over the color grade for the film. If we look at this example shot here, the three most visible characteristics of the grade are it's cold, it's desaturated, and it's contrasty. In Lumetri Color, the first thing I did, as I always do, was add my favorite free orange and teal LUT from Lutify and set the intensity to 50. Then I edited the basic adjustments and added some contrast in the curves. I also used the curves to add a little bit of a green tint in the shadows. To get the cold look, I simply pulled the temperature slider over rather strongly. Also, in the basic adjustments, I desaturated the whole image a little. But to really make the footage look more post-apocalyptic, I went into the curves. Here, with the hue versus saturation curve, I desaturated the greens and especially the yellows, and also the blues a little bit, and lastly also the magenta tones. Then, in the hue versus luma curve, I darkened the green hues and slightly darkened the oranges. Next, I wanted to add even more contrast and make the footage just a little bit colder. To do that, I used the color wheels to add some blue in the midtones and in the shadows. Additionally, I slightly darkened the midtones for that extra contrast. By now, the grade is looking pretty cool and post-apocalyptic, but the skin tones are far from correct. Therefore, in the HSL tab, I selected the skin tones, warmed them up, and pulled them slightly over to magenta. To balance out that adjustment, which did look a little too hard, I also desaturated the skin tones a bit. An extra adjustment I made on only some shots were masks to create gradients. Here, for example, I added a heavily feathered mask at the top to darken the sky. That pretty much summarizes what went into color grading. To adopt the color grade onto the other clips, I copied the adjustment layer and tweaked the grade when necessary. Now let's get back to editing. As said before, I had only done the rough cut so far, and the clips I hadn't shot yet were for now replaced by text. So the beginning of the film at this point was looking like this. Before I'd refine the cut, I wanted to find my music for the film so that I can time the cut according to the score. To find my music, I was going through lots and lots of tracks on a music site you probably all know, Epidemic Sound. I went to their list of genres and searched from there. Mostly I looked for fitting tracks in the subgenres of films such as suspense or mystery. Another promising genre they offered was drones. In case you don't know what a drone is when speaking of sound, I didn't know before, this is a drone. I spent quite some time just clicking through song after song listening for elements I enjoyed. Every time I found a track that either completely fitted the film or just had elements which fitted the film, I downloaded the stems, so that I can choose to pick out only certain elements if I don't want to use the whole mix. After a good amount of searching, I had a little collection of potential scores and drones. Next I started to try out various songs and drones for certain sequences. After quite a lot of trial and error, I decided to use this as the opening. This is actually a combination of multiple different scores, drones, and sound effects. The very first thing you hear is this impact sound effect. And then the first 11 seconds consist of this low drone. And then, when the helmets appear, you hear this added sound. This is part of a soundtrack which I think was an epidemic for horror. I only picked out that one sound to enhance the helmet's appearance. Then the low drone continues, and as you can see in the timeline, 2 new tracks slowly fade in. One track is another drone, but a higher one. And the other track is again just part of an actual soundtrack. I liked the build-up character of the string, therefore I picked it out of the stems and added it. Then all tracks become gradually louder, and to enhance the rising effect I added this wind sound and this riser. When all of these elements are played together, they appear to be one track that fits the sequence perfectly, but as I just showed you, it's actually quite a stitching job. The rest of the soundtracks I used for the film were not as much of a mixture. Sometimes I slightly changed the volume of a certain stem, but not much more. The last score is the unedited full mix. Well, almost. I had to repeat the section of the ending so that it continues until the end of the film. After getting the music done, I refined the cut. Very important when editing a film is continuity editing, except of course you artistically don't edit for continuity. But for Encounter, I wanted to edit continuously, so when editing I always kept an eye on the actor's movement to match it across a cut. After fine-tuning the cut, it was time for some details. What I mean with details is little extra adjustments to give a clip or a scene a little bit of spice. Here, for example, I keyframed a very slow camera movement by increasing the scale and moving the frame upwards slightly. By the way, in case you're wondering how I'm able to move the frame upwards, this is possible thanks to the aspect ratio. I filmed the entire film in a 16:9 aspect ratio, but the final result should be a 1:2.35 aspect ratio. Therefore, in Premiere, I can move my clip up and down a little, because the aspect ratio crops away part of the top and the bottom. Another shot where I used this technique is this one. As you can see, the camera seems to tilt up slightly, but this shot was actually a static shot and the tilt was added in post. Something I added here was a subtle glow effect on the highlights. Because we were shooting in the forest where it's dark and I was exposing for Joseph walking through it, my highlights were blown out. While editing, I thought a glow effect could make the blown out white spots look a little cooler, and indeed, I think it's a nice subtle effect. I also added this to the opening shot. Okay, next topic, VFX. I'm honestly not entirely sure if VFX is the right word for the stuff I did here. It sounds much cooler than the things I actually did. Some might also call it compositing, and others will have other words for it, I don't really know. What I did to many shots was erase various elements which weren't supposed to be in the film. In my idea of the film, the main character is walking through this empty world which doesn't seem to have any civilization. In that case, this shot here would not fit very well with that logic, because in the background you can clearly see houses. Or well, maybe not so clearly because they're blurry, but you can still identify them as buildings. Therefore, I had to erase them. Most of this stuff was done in Premiere, and I only used After Effects for 2 shots. And now let me tell you something worth noting. I learned an important lesson when it comes to erasing elements of your shot. This was all done with masks, and what I only realized when it was pretty much too late was do not do extensive masking in Premiere. After Effects is your friend. I'll explain why in further detail a little later. First, let me show you how I actually erased the houses. Let's take this shot as an example. The way masking works is you can cut out a part of your frame. So what I did was duplicate the shot and use only a cut out part of the shot above and place that above the house. That then looked like this. As you can see, I cut out as much as possible of the forest before getting Joseph in my masked frame. To keep the same frame, I froze the frame before masking it, so that Joseph doesn't suddenly appear inside the masked area. And also, to make the cut of the mask less visible, I feathered the edge a good bit. So next I wanted to fill in that gap in the forest. I did that by duplicating the mask I had just made and moved it to the side above the gap. Now the house is gone, but the masking is pretty visible. If you look at the forest, you can easily see that the left side of the forest just repeats itself 3 times. What gives this away so easily is that gap in the forest with the light coming through, which repeats itself. Therefore, to fix that, I yet again duplicated the mask, but this time I only masked a small part of a tree, which I then placed above the light. I did the same with the other gap, but with a different mask to create some more variety. And then I added another mask to add this bush here, simply to create even more variety, because as soon as a pattern becomes visible, the masking becomes visible. With these masks, the house has now fully disappeared. Let me point out two important factors which made this possible. Firstly, the footage was shot at a low aperture, which results in a decently blurry background. That made the masking easier because simply by feathering the masks it was possible to make them pretty much invisible in all the blurriness. This would have been much harder if the forest was sharp. And the second factor which made this a little easier was that the shot was static. Therefore, I could make a mask and I was done, whereas if the shot moved, the mask would also have to move. That is where After Effects comes into play. Because I did also have a shot which needed the same kind of masking, but the shot was not static. Here you can see the shot slightly moves with the movement Joseph does, and this is an in-camera movement, not added in post-production. Unfortunately, I left this correction pretty much to the end of the editing process and only then found out how good After Effects worked for exactly this kind of work. This was where I learned that in the future I should always do masking in After Effects. It turns out that the whole process just works much smoother in After Effects. The masking tool in Premiere works, but it's laggy and just not very comfortable to use, whereas the masking tool in After Effects is pretty much the same as in Premiere, but without the problems. Therefore, if any of you have to do masking like I did here, I really encourage you to do it in After Effects, it'll work much better. So let's get back to this shot. What I did here was, again, mask out a part of the forest and place that mask above the house that needs to disappear. The problem that then arose is that the mask is still, and as soon as the camera moves, you see the mask. So to fix that, I created a null object, which is basically just an object but it's invisible. You'll understand why this is necessary in a minute. Next, I let After Effects track the movement of something in the shot, in this case a part of the house. That tracked movement I then applied to the null object. So now the null object moves with the shot. So all I needed to do then was use the so-called parent pick whip to tell my mask to move exactly like the null object does. And by doing that, the mask now moves with the camera movement. A small but important detail with the masks I should mention is that I added a blur. This was necessary in the shots in which the focus shifted, because, as mentioned earlier, I froze the frame of my mask so that my cutout pieces don't change. That consequently meant that as soon as the focus of the original shot shifted, the focus of the mask didn't. Therefore, I added a Gaussian blur to the mask and keyframed the blurriness according to the shot. Another bit of tedious work I had to do with the mask was keyframing the mask itself. This was sometimes necessary because in this shot, for example, Joseph walks across the frame and also across the masked area. That meant when he passed a mask, the mask suddenly became visible. Therefore, I had to keyframe the mask to adjust according to Joseph's movement. That sums up most of the masking I did. In many shots I did add more masks to erase small things like here. But I think that's enough talking about masks. Let's get to the last topic of the video, sound design. I kept the sound design of the film rather basic, with a few little exceptions. For most of the film I simply added the obvious sounds you should hear, like the rain in this shot or the footsteps. A part of the film where I went slightly beyond the obvious sounds was every shot of the necklace. Every time the necklace was shown, I added this drone sound. This is a small detail, but I think it's these kind of details that bring a film to the next level. Also in this shot, I added a wind sound, which was actually even written in the script already. Two parts where I even went quite in depth with the effects were the voiceovers. Here's the first voice.
Do you remember how we met?
And the second voice.
Yes, it seems like a dream.
To edit these recordings, I used the music production program Ableton Live and added various effects to the recordings. The two important ones are the reverb.
Do you remember how we met? Do you remember how we met?
And the echo.
Do you remember how we met?
Additionally, to the female voice, I added this here. I used this to make the voice not quite so sudden, because without it, the voice kinda came out of nowhere, but with this added, this acts like a little warning that something is coming. To the male voice, I added the same effects, but without the warning, because for him it wasn't necessary, the score already acted as that warning. Here's the before and after of the male voice.
Yes, it seems like a dream. Yes, it seems like a dream.
That's more or less all there is to show of the sound design. Sadly, I have to say that the outcome of the sound design is the part of the post-production I'm least satisfied with. There's especially one part of the film which just doesn't sound realistic in my opinion. The coughs here just don't sound real to me, but this was the best I could get. I spent quite some time on this part, but I just couldn't make it better than this. In conclusion, however, I am very satisfied with the overall outcome of the film. With that said, this 3-part series is now done. I very much hope you could find a lot of value in the behind-the-scenes content of the short film. I was especially looking forward to this video because so many things happen in post-production which are later overlooked when viewing the finished film. So if you stayed until here in the video, firstly, thank you. And secondly, I really hope I could give you a valuable perspective on what went into post-production. If there is anything I explained too broadly and you'd like to have a more in-depth tutorial on a certain topic, please just tell me in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like, it helps me out and the channel to grow a little bigger. Consider subscribing if you haven't yet, and I hope to see you again next week in the next video. Until then, goodbye.